Hi guys, Olive here today to review two books on moths. The first book I'll be talking about is called Much Ado About Mothing, A Year Intoxicated by Britain's Rare and Remarkable Moths by James Lowen. This book was published in 2021 by Bloomsbury, and my hardcover copy that I purchased with my own money comes in at 384 pages. Much Ado About Mothing is a blend of natural history and travel memoir. The author is a naturalist and a photographer, and he talks at the start of this book about falling in love with moths. And then he went on a year-long quest to try to see as many species of moth across Britain as he possibly could. The goal was to see around 120 different species. Now you may be asking, what on earth would inspire someone to do this? And once upon a time, the author would have shared in your confusion about people who endeavor to see all different species of moths. But it turns out it is a full-fledged hobby akin to birding, except it's called mothing, hence this book's title. People who participate are called mothers. James Lowen wasn't always a mother. There was a time when he actually found them pretty drab, and that's actually a favorable impression compared to the way a lot of people see moths. They're generally considered to be pests, nuisances. Certain ones eat away at your sweaters or invade your pantry. They are not exactly well loved. But then, one day, a friend of the author introduced him to a gorgeous specimen, and from that day forward, he was hooked. He notes at different points throughout this book that a simple introduction to really any of the gorgeous, docile species of moths that exist out there is sometimes enough to change people's minds about moths, or even talk them out of being scared of moths. These are extremely gentle creatures. They don't sting or bite. They just kind of sit there looking stunning. They even allow for photo ops. They are just gracious that way. People out there who already love butterflies, you will be thrilled to know that a moth is essentially the exact same creature. It's just that a moth is the nocturnal counterpart to a butterfly. Moths are butterflies with bad PR, as the author says in this book. And it was exactly that won the author over to the side of the moths. And he started to develop more and more of a fixation on wanting to see as many moths as he possibly could. He started out, like most people do, with a moth trap, which are completely harmless, uses a light to attract moths in overnight. Then in the morning, you go out there, see what moths came in, you look at them, you gawk at them, and then they're free to go after that. But once the author had exhausted all of the moths in his area, once he had seen all the ones in his direct vicinity, he wanted to see more. He wanted to go out there and see all the different moths that Britain had to offer. So in this book, he talks about traveling around, often with companions, trying to be in the places as the moths he was seeking out, or using different methods to bring them to him, like pheromones. He does include a small discussion within this book about the ethical use of pheromones. Those can fall into the wrong hands. They're very powerful, so you need to use them sparingly. But he did use those sometimes. You hear about how those work. Some moths, though, are endangered, and the government actually forbids you trapping them. So the author didn't get to see those, but he got to see many, many others. And as he's meeting these moths, so are we as readers. He gives some beautiful descriptions of what these moths look like, what it felt like to see them, all the excitement, and then he seizes those opportunities to tell us more about the different species of moths and all of their amazing capabilities. He started off his quest in the winter, so the moths that he was catching were ones that were very hardy, able to survive during the winter. Some of them can even make their own antifreeze. But then as we move into spring, we learn about different kinds of moths. We learn about how they are pollinators, similar to butterflies or bees. We learn that some of them are adept at mimicry, and we also learn all about their life cycle, which if you know anything about butterflies, it'll ring familiar. Throughout, his enthusiasm for moths and for the hobby of mothing is so clear. It is absolutely infectious. And what I haven't mentioned before this point is that he actually shares that love of moths with his school-aged daughter. She loves them too, and his stories of sharing that hobby with her, it's just downright wholesome. Overall, this is a very charming read, but unlike the moths that he talks about in this book, I wouldn't call it attention grabbing. It's missing some zest. It's missing some kind of something, especially with the writing, to really feel like it's pulling you through, like it has a narrative thread to it. I felt like that was missing from this book, which was a little bit disappointing. I will admit, I think it was a little bit harder for me as a newbie to Moths and Mothing to get into this one. It didn't exactly include a ton of introductory material. I did learn a lot from this, but I think the people who will enjoy this the most are people who are already somewhat familiar with moths and maybe even have their own traps. But speaking of those traps, the second book I'm going to be talking about today was actually named for them. It's called The Jewel Box: How Moths Illuminate Nature's Hidden Rules by Tim Blackburn. This one came out in 2023. It was published by Island Press, and the hardcover copy comes in at 288 pages. However, I read a digital advance copy that I received for free for reviewing purposes through Edelweiss. Since this book is titled after a much fancier name for a moth trap, as in you open up the box and you see what jewels are inside, it is quite fitting that this book opens up with a very engaging description of a moth trap. I mean, the way he puts it, it ceases to be a simple box with a light attached. Instead, it becomes a way to summon magical creatures previously unknown to you. If you aren't already convinced to try trapping moths yourself, you will be after reading that. The author has a good reason for focusing so much on moth traps, titling his book after one. He intends to use what you would find within that moth trap the morning after setting it as a case study. Because when you look into a moth trap that has hopefully caught some moths, you are getting a window into the hidden parts of nature. What you find within that moth trap, how many moths total, what different species, how many of each species, how big is each moth, all of these things say something about what invisible forces are going on within the natural world. And that's what the author wants to talk about most within this book. So it's a book about moths, but it's also not. It's a book about ecology and the natural world, and he uses the moths that he would find within a moth trap to spark those grander conversations. So for example, he found a gypsy moth inside of his moth trap. So he gives a story about how once there was a population explosion of gypsy moths in Massachusetts, and then he goes into a conversation about population dynamics within the natural world to deduce how that could have happened. This book is made up of discussions just like that one. It is essentially an ecology class you can hold in your hand. I shouldn't have been all that surprised by that. This author is a biology professor at University College London, and just reading this book, you can feel what it would be like to sit in on one of his lectures. I would love to do that because I find all of this fascinating and I just love the way he puts things. It probably goes without saying then that this one is on the academic side. I personally have taken 2 different ecology courses throughout my life, one in high school, another in college, so I was familiar with some of the concepts brought up within this book. It was very helpful, though, to have the moths there to demonstrate some of those concepts. I really enjoyed that. This is one that will teach you a lot, but it's going to ask a lot of you. It is very intense. And I think anyone going into this looking only for a discussion about moths is going to be disappointed. But I do have to give a ton of credit to the author and the publisher for giving this one an appropriate title. It is so rare that publishers do that. I think the title itself, The Jewel Box, is perfect. It's referring to a moth trap, which is what this book discusses. But then also the subtitle. The subtitle is perfect. How Moths Illuminate Nature's Hidden Rules. That is exactly what this book does. That is what the author aimed to do, and he achieves it in this book. How much you are going to enjoy this book is going to be dependent on how willing you are to dive into some more advanced science. I learned a ton about moths and so much more from reading these 2 books, which, even though they're on the same subject, could not be more different. Normally in these 2 books on videos that I make, there's some overlap in talking about the books because they're on the exact same subject. You imagine that they would talk about similar things. Not the case with these 2 books. It felt like they were on 2 totally different planets. Much Ado About Mothing was much more quaint and personal, and The Jewel Box was much more high level and sweeping in scope. I will say, Going into these two books, I think what I was looking for was something more in the middle of those two experiences, something that included a bunch of moth facts, but that was also a little bit personal. So I'm walking away from this experience a touch unsatisfied, but I do definitely think that both of these books have something to offer. But those were my thoughts on these two books on moths. If you have any of your own, or if you have any feedback, comments, or questions for me, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. If you want to see where you can get your hands on copies of these books if you're interested, I've put links for you in the description box below. And also in that description box, I've included something that I like to call the further reading section, where I've listed out some book titles that you might want to check out if this topic interests you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.